Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I too rise to speak on the Social Services Legislation Amendment Enhanced Welfare Payment Integrity Bill 2016, and it's my great pleasure to do so, Mr Deputy Speaker. As we've just heard from a very fine contribution from the member for Ryan, this bill contains two measures which strengthen our capacity to recover social welfare and family payment debts. There are amendments to allow for the use of departure prohibition orders to prevent targeted social welfare debtors from leaving the country, as currently applies to child support debtors. And the bill also contains amendments to remove the current 6-year limitation on the recovery of social welfare debt that would otherwise be non-recoverable, aligning the treatment of social welfare debt with the recovery arrangements in place for other Commonwealth agencies. Mr Deputy Speaker, while the average value of social welfare debt is some $2,350 and the average length of debt is just over 3 years, the oldest outstanding debt that the Commonwealth is currently facing is over 30 years old, and the greatest amount of debt is in excess of $300,000. So the situation is this, Mr Deputy Speaker. At the end of June 2015, there were over 1 million debts with a value of $3.04 billion. Now, I say that again, debts owed to the Commonwealth of $3.04 billion. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, it is with great pride that I stand here and say that is not good enough. Why didn't Labor tackle this question? Why didn't Labor pass these amendments when it was in power? This is a monumental amount of money. It is taxpayers' money. It is owed to the taxpayers. Just consider what this amount of money could do, the schools and hospitals it could build, the passenger rail that it could develop, the roads, the contribution it could make to our economy in many, many different respects. $3.04 billion. And this demonstrates, led of course by the Minister for Social Services, Minister Porter, this demonstrates that our government has a very strong commitment on making sure that every single dollar that we raise by way of revenue is properly spent, and that we make sure that we deliver the money with great responsibility, the revenue into the Commonwealth, and where there are these very significant debts, we will make sure that we do everything we can to recover them. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, these debts have increased by almost 10% in value since June 2014. I mean, they are skyrocketing. And yet, under the previous Labor government, we did not see the appropriate action put in place to recover these debts. And I think most Australians would agree, Mr Deputy Speaker, that this is a very fair and reasonable measure. This money is owed to the Commonwealth. In many respects, it concerns those who were on a welfare payment and who have now exited the system, so they're no longer on the system. And we assume that they are working, they're earning an income, and they're making a contribution to their family and, of course, to the broader society. But they're doing this with a black cloud hanging over their head, which is impacting on the Australian economy very significantly. And we are determined to do something about it. Mr Deputy Speaker, of this debt base, approximately $870 million is held by around 270,000 former recipients who do not make sufficient or regular payments. Current recipients of social welfare payments who also have a social security or family assistance debt have their welfare payments reduced until their debts are paid. So there is a mechanism in place for the Commonwealth over time to recover those debts. However, there is no similar arrangement in place to recover debts once a person no longer requires social welfare or family assistance payments, because, of course, they're no longer part of the system, including, of course, the Centrelink system. So the government considers it is entirely reasonable for people who owe debts to the Commonwealth, to the taxpayers of Australia, to make the necessary arrangements to repay that debt in full within a reasonable amount of time. Mr Deputy Speaker, some debtors deliberately avoid their obligation to repay their debts to the Commonwealth by not entering into acceptable repayment arrangements, and in extreme cases they head overseas beyond Australia's jurisdiction. This legislation will allow the Secretary of the Department to issue a departure prohibition order to prevent targeted social welfare debtors from leaving the country, as currently applies to child support and taxation debtors. And this has been a very effective mechanism. Departure prohibition orders have been very effective in recovering outstanding child support debts. Between 2005 and 2015, 4,551 new departure prohibition orders were issued, resulting in the collection of $52 million in outstanding child support payments. Now, we say if it's fair enough to recover child support payments from those who are refusing to meet their obligations, and I think every mother, every father would agree that child support must be paid, and a parent who has that obligation leaving the country should not reasonably be able to do so without paying their debts. We take the same approach for other social welfare debtors. Now, people who have a departure prohibition order issued may still depart Australia in certain circumstances, such as for humanitarian reasons or in Australia's best interests. So this might include, Mr Deputy Speaker, a visit overseas to attend to an ill relative, to attend a funeral, a cultural ceremony of a deceased relative, or where international travel is a condition of employment. And where people do need to depart Australia on humanitarian grounds without paying their debt in full, they can make an application for a departure authorisation certificate. The application must be verified by, for example, provision of a medical report regarding the condition of the relative or a death certificate. But we say we're not going to allow this to continue any longer. We have a good system in place to recover child support debts when parents attempt to leave the country and not meet their proper obligations. And why should other debtors in our social welfare system be treated any differently? This was a form of discrimination, frankly, Mr Deputy Speaker, that prevailed under the previous government. We think this is a very important issue to address and to fix, and we're very, very pleased to be doing that. The other important aspect of this bill, as I mentioned, is that it introduces the legislative amendments required to remove the 6-year statute of limitations on the recovery of social welfare payment debt, which will allow Centrelink to recover the social welfare payment debt regardless of the age of the debt. Now, this is a very important measure. As at the end of 2014-2015, there were 36,834 debts worth $131.2 million that will reach their expiry date within 1 year. Now, that's before the legislation has been passed. Centrelink hasn't touched these debts for 6 years and won't have the capacity to reach into those debtors and recover them. There are 54,200 debts worth $166.81 million that have already reached their expiry date, and so also cannot be recovered by compulsory means, and that includes by withholding, garnishing wages, garnishing through taxation means or any sort of civil action. So when you look at the amount of money involved, Mr Deputy Speaker, because of this limitation period of 6 years, it absolutely stands to reason that it should be extended so that at any time the Commonwealth can rightly say, this money is owed to us, we want it back. We want it back because we need to spend it on behalf of the Australian taxpayer for our schools, our hospitals, our roads, our rail, our social services and many other functions, of course, that the Commonwealth performs in looking after the Australian people. So what has been happening, of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that these debts are written off and we are literally seeing money going down the drain. This has become, in effect, an interest-free loan from the taxpayers of Australia. So stay out of the radar of the Commonwealth for some 6 years and then you get off scot-free. Well, we say that that's not good enough. That those Australians who do owe a debt to the Commonwealth should not be able to get off scot-free. And I'm very pleased, and I also say this as the chair of the Social Services Coalition Backbench Policy Committee, I'm very pleased that Minister Porter, the Minister for Social Services, received very strong support from the committee to implement these measures. Now, that's not to say that there are some Australians with these debts who will encounter some hardship and who may need some time to pay these debts off. And we encourage them to talk to staff at Centrelink about their ability to pay off the debt over time. In cases of severe financial hardship, a thorough review of their capacity to repay will be undertaken, and debtors will be given a fair amount of time to repay their debt. So we're not expecting, Mr Deputy Speaker, this debt to be paid overnight, and we don't want to put someone through acute financial hardship as a result of the recovery of the debt. But we want something in place to make sure that over time this debt can be recovered. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is one of the many measures the Turnbull government is undertaking to implement a fairer system, to make sure that the money that the Commonwealth raises is spent on those who most need our help. And we have done this in many ways. And another very important way, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the government's new multinational tax avoidance laws, unfortunately opposed by Labor, inexplicably opposed by Labor, which came into effect on the 1st of January and will ensure that major international companies operating in Australia but booking profits offshore have to pay tax here. And it is a shameful reflection. As I take that interjection, it is a shameful reflection on the Labor Party that we joined with the Greens in the Senate to pass this legislation. And this goes to show that we are serious about making sure that dollars do not get thrown down the drain, whether it's debts that owed by Australian taxpayers or whether it's multinationals ripping off Australians, ripping off Australian jobs. And what the Labor Party has done is that they have said, in not supporting our legislation, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Labor Party has said we do not have any interest in combating multinational tax avoidance. We do not care. We are quite happy for this money to keep on going offshore, denying Australians important revenue and denying Australian jobs. This is not good for Australians, and I say very strongly that this is a good example of where the Greens have joined with our government to support this legislation to ensure it gets through, to maximise the revenue for Australians, to maximise the revenue for this government. And it is a shocking indictment, and we know it's a shocking indictment because whenever this is raised, as happened today in question time, members opposite hang their heads in shame. They know that this is a terrible error, that this sends an appalling message to Australians that the Labor Party is not serious about combating multinational tax avoidance, and it really is a disgrace. Mr Deputy Speaker, in so many ways we are very proud of these important measures that we've taken. Other legislation to ban excessive credit card surcharges. Again, such an important consumer protection measure that the Labor Party never took on. And it is incredibly important that Australians know they are governed by a government which cares with compassion and with a sense of fairness. And that's another great example of how we are standing up for Australians and saying we will not cop people being ripped off. Again, we never saw any movement on that issue under Labor. Mr Deputy Speaker, whether it's implementing our free trade agreements, signing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whether it's rolling out our $1.1 billion innovation agenda, we are very, very proud of the work that we are doing. Locally, so much is happening in my electorate. The new ABS Centre of Excellence, the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, $2.6 million for Geelong Region Job Connections, a new trade stud office, hundreds and hundreds of jobs being created through the Geelong Region Innovation and Investment Fund. Whether it's our big national policy changes or whether it's locally on the ground in Corangamite, I'm very proud of our government's efforts and I commend this bill to the House.